All right, guys, this is video numero uno of 89. Oh my goodness, we're going to do 89 of these. We're going to go through every chapter in every gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in each chapter, we're going to pull out one thing that kind of tells us what is love. This is love is the title of this 89-day, oh my goodness, 3-month series. So we start, of course, with Matthew, the first book, the first gospel, the first chapter. And I love that Matthew has laid out the genealogy, the family history, so-and-so begot so-and-so begot so-and-so. I feel like I'm rapping, of Jesus' family. And here's the first headline from Matthew chapter 1. This is love. What is love? This is love, to celebrate, to lift up, to shine a light on, and to recognize the vulnerable and the outcast. I will say it again. I love it so much. From Matthew chapter 1, what is love? This is love, to celebrate, to lift up, to shine a light on the vulnerable, the outcast, the one that's different. And so in the genealogy of Jesus, very unusual back then, kind of unusual nowadays, unfortunately, too, but very unusual back then. I mean, extremely strange for the writer of a genealogy to shine a light on the women in the genealogy. In fact, Matthew goes out of his way, for example, when he says, by the way, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, and Perez is going to be the father of the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy. But he says, pause, by the way, whose mother was Tamar. Well, Tamar and Judah's fault, by the way, had not a very clean, PG, good, healthy relationship. You can look it up for yourself. And then later in verse 5, he says, now Salmon was the father of Boaz. Oh, and by the way, whose mother was Rahab. Rahab, ever heard of Rahab the prostitute, right? So now he says, hey, let's pause for a second and point out that there is a prostitute who's a part of Jesus's family history. And then he goes on in verse 6 and says, David was the father of Solomon. Oh, and if you can't remember, I mean, who can't remember? They can all remember it says, whose mother was Bathsheba, and he decides to write the widow of Uriah. And by the way, if you don't know, she's the widow of Uriah because David killed Uriah, okay? So this is another kind of not something that most people would be very proud of and be celebrating. But Matthew, the writer here, wants us all to know that Jesus didn't come from a perfect family, from a perfect line, because guess what? None of us did. And he wants us to know that it's certain people that we might typically go, let's not tell that story. Let's not lift those people up. Let's not celebrate or shine a light on those people who are actually very valuable in the kingdom of God. He goes on and he says, let's see, Ruth, actually I skipped over Ruth, but Ruth is in verse 5 as well. He says, Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Well, Ruth was a Moabite, so she was a foreigner, okay? Right? She was not an Israelite back then, and unfortunately, in certain people's minds and in certain countries today, being a foreigner, right, is not necessarily something that puts you on equal footing, right, with other people. But for Matthew, he says, hey, by the way, Ruth the Moabite, the foreigner, is a part of the Messiah's line. And he gives some other examples. I like this last one, though. He says in verse 16, Jacob was the father of Joseph, who is the husband of Mary, and Mary gave birth to Jesus. And he goes on to explain that actually Joseph and Mary never got together, right? She's the Virgin Mary before Mary gives birth to Jesus. So little secret here, guys, let you in on some. Jesus is not a blood relative of any of these people. Jesus is a blood relative of Mary's family. How crazy, right? How crazy is that? And I think it's incredible that God, through Matthew, wants to highlight for us, wants to celebrate, wants to shine a light on and say, guess what? It's actually not about the exact names and the exact people that Jesus was related to. It's certainly not about making sure we only remember the the heroes or the perfect ones, or David, he killed that Goliath. Not even mentioned, but in fact, it's mentioned that he did kill Uriah, right? And it was like a massive wrong thing, right? He was a murderer, right? And God says, listen, this is love. To recognize that we're all imperfect, to have and live with empathy, and to lift up and celebrate and shine a light on the vulnerable and the outcast. Let's learn from even just the family history of Jesus and the way that Matthew records it, that what is love? This is love. To really, really live authentic lives and to lift up the vulnerable and the outcast. I'm excited to start this with you guys. I'm excited to go to chapter 2 tomorrow. We'll see where it all takes us. Thanks so much.